On this Sunday night, a fragile ceasefire in Gaza begins. An emotional homecoming for the first 3 Israeli hostages, while displaced Gazans return to what's left of their homes, and much-needed aid finally pours into the battered region. Chaos for Chrystia. Protesters try to derail the former finance minister's first official campaign event for the Liberal leadership. And Inauguration Eve.
We won!
Washington prepares for President-elect Trump to be sworn in, and Canada braces for possible tariffs.
Global National. Reporting tonight, Carolyn Jarvis.
You are looking at the moment Israeli hostages reunited with their loved ones today. The 3 women were captured 471 days ago during the deadly Hamas attacks in southern Israel. In exchange, Israel confirmed it has just released 90 Palestinians, all women and minors, as part of the deal. Good evening, and thanks for joining us. It has been an historic day in the Middle East as the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas is now in effect. Aid is flowing into Gaza, and Palestinians are finally able to return home. But for a moment, it seemed as if it wouldn't happen. Our Jeff Semple is in Tel Aviv with the details on a day filled with anxiety, tension, and relief. Jeff.
Well, Carolyn, it really was an extraordinary day here in Israel that ended on a high note. A sea of anxious faces. Thousands gathered for hours, waiting for news of the 3 Israeli hostages set to be released, including 24-year-old Romi Gonen. Her mother has spent the past 471 days clinging to hope.
I'm focused on my decision that she will come home alive. There is nothing else.
After 15 months of war, today brought the promise of peace, a planned prisoner swap, and a ceasefire for Gaza, the entire region holding its breath.
It's very fragile. It can collapse every second.
And it almost did. The ceasefire was supposed to begin at 8:30 a.m., but Hamas still hadn't confirmed which hostages would be released. So Israel continued bombing, reportedly killing at least 19 Palestinians. A few hours later, the names were sent. The airstrikes stopped, and the celebration began. Gazans flooded back to their war-ravaged homes as hundreds of trucks carrying desperately needed aid and food poured into communities on the brink of famine. I'm going home to my family and my victory, even in its ruins, Palestinian Ali Azouabri told Global News. God is great. The joy is truly indescribable. And then came these ominous images that appear to show Hamas gunmen back out in the open, patrolling the streets. A reminder the group has been decimated, but not defeated. This afternoon, tense moments broadcast live around the world as Hamas pulled the 3 Israeli hostages through the crowds, handing them over to the Red Cross, then driven across the border to Israel.
Well, this is a moment that people here have been waiting 15 months for. They just announced the news that those 3 Israeli hostages are on their way home. How are you feeling? What was that like?
Relieved. I'm so happy, I want to cry.
A country long consumed by fear and anger erupted in joy. And nowhere more than here. The hostages' families held a private vigil where they were reunited with their sisters and daughters, including Romi Gonen and her mother. An emotional homecoming that's hard for most to imagine, but Gilly Roman knows the feeling.
In a heartbeat, your whole life is changing back again.
His sister Yarden was also taken hostage by Hamas, but released 2 months later, back in November 2023.
You see her face on the screen, you see her walk, and you know that we have her. And it's like a ghost coming back to life.
The hostages will now be transferred to hospitals, including this one. We took a tour of the returnees ward, specifically designed to care for the hostages upon their release, prepared to treat a range of injuries, both physical and mental.
In medicine and in nursing, there's no textbook that is written about people who came back after 470 days. It's unbelievable.
And some Palestinians have been detained for much longer. In exchange for the hostages, Israel was expected to release around 90 Palestinians, including convicted murderers and terrorists, as well as political prisoners, such as politician Khalida Jarrar and Neil Barghouti, detained for 4 decades.
Happy to see him with me, happy to feel like we are going to see him again.
But his wife worries they won't be reunited. Barghouti and others, whom Israel considers a threat, will not be allowed into the West Bank, released instead into Gaza.
I am afraid now if they, deport Nail outside of Palestine, that it will be difficult for me to go to be with him because I'm not sure that the Israeli side will let me go.
Jeff, as you mentioned, today was the return of the first 3 hostages. What can we expect to see next?
Well, it's believed there are around 60 Israeli hostages still alive inside of Gaza. And over the next 6 weeks or so, around half of those, 33, are scheduled to be released in small groups, along with hundreds more Palestinian prisoners. All of that, of course, is assuming that this ceasefire holds. Carolyn?
Jeff Semple in Tel Aviv. Thank you. In Toronto, family members of Romy Gonen celebrated her freedom. Her Canadian cousin, who has advocated tirelessly for her release, expressed gratitude.
Hope became our greatest source of power, as well as our heaviest burden. This is an extraordinary moment that proves each of us have the power to stand up against injustice, against all odds.
And later in the newscast, we'll take you back inside Gaza as Palestinians displaced by 15 months of war return home. It was pro-Palestinian demonstrators who interrupted a campaign launch for Chrystia Freeland, who's running to be the next Liberal leader and Prime Minister. Protesters repeatedly interrupted the Toronto event, a couple of them even storming the stage. Mackenzie Gray reports.
It's the vibe Chrystia Freeland wanted, a man-eater, ready to take on Donald Trump. But that enthusiasm was short-lived. Over 20 pro-Palestinian demonstrators individually interrupting Freeland's campaign launch.
It's good to protest, it's part of being Canadian. But it is not okay to stop others from speaking, right?
With no police on site at the time, Freeland's staff and even some MPs having to pull up protesters themselves, thinning out an enthusiastic crowd that had roughly 200 people to start.
As foreign minister, I stood up to Donald Trump.
Freeland seemingly not deterred, eventually getting back on message.
If you force our hand, we will inflict the biggest trade blow that the United States has ever endured.
Trying to make the leadership race about who best can handle the incoming U.S. president. Her plan? Dollar-for-dollar tariffs against the U.S. if Trump follows through on his threats.
Canada is not for sale, and our sovereignty is not negotiable.
But Freeland is willing to negotiate on past policy positions. Despite serving as Justin Trudeau's most senior minister for 9 years, she's walking away from a signature policy that she strongly defended, the carbon tax.
We have heard very clearly from Canadians in provinces where there is a consumer-facing price on carbon that they don't like it.
Freeland's proximity to Trudeau a likely liability, and she tried to distance herself from him during her over-hour-long speech, saying she's been at odds with Trudeau for some time, and it got worse once Trump threatened tariffs.
I fought back against the Prime Minister when I knew the time had come to put our country first.
The rocky campaign launch might not even been the worst part of Freeland's day, Carolyn. Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly endorsed Mark Carney, bringing a huge political organization within her home province of Quebec, a major boost for Freeland's main rival.
Mackenzie Gray in Toronto, thank you. Another Liberal leadership candidate officially launched her campaign today, Government House Leader Karina Gould. The Burlington, Ontario MP may not be a household name, but as Touria Izri reports, she's considered a rising star in the Liberal Party.
My name is Karina Gould, and I'm running to be the next leader of the Liberal Party of Canada. Karina Gould is vowing to bring the Liberals back in step with voters.
Canadians have lost trust in our party. And if we are going to be able to keep building our country, we must rebuild our party.
The 37-year-old is vying to become Canada's youngest prime minister.
It's time for a new generation of leadership.
I think Karina is an outstanding member of parliament, and I'm glad she's running.
As Families Minister, she helped push the national childcare program over the finish line.
Reject the radical plan for...
And as government House Leader, she's seen as an effective attack dog.
It seems that the things that are good that he takes credit for were things that were Liberal policies.
Gould is resigning from her cabinet post to focus on the race. During her political career, she's claimed some notable firsts. The youngest woman in federal cabinet, the first minister to give birth in office and go on maternity leave.
I've had my eye on Karina Gould for some time, actually. I think she's a very impressive individual, very bilingual, speaks Spanish as well.
One Liberal MP says now is not her time.
She has energy and imagination and creativity, but I'm looking for someone who's got experience at negotiating with Donald Trump.
I have tremendous affection for both, Chrystia Freeland and Mark Carney. I just don't think Donald Trump is going to care whether you were a banker or a journalist or a baker, for that matter.
Like her rivals Freeland and Carney, Gould also appears to be backing away from consumer carbon pricing by saying she'd freeze an increase in April. Touria, Izri, Global News, Montreal.
One of the first orders of business for whomever becomes prime minister will be building relations with incoming U.S. President Donald Trump. His inauguration tomorrow had to be moved indoors because of frigid temperatures, meaning a much smaller in-person audience. So today, Trump met with a large crowd of supporters as the energy builds for his return to office. Bianca Fascini was outside the event tonight.
President-elect Donald Trump is holding a pre-inauguration rally here at Capital One Arena. It's just a day before he'll be sworn in for his second term, but without the typical inauguration crowd.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Trump supporters traveled from all over the U.S. to attend Sunday's rally, featuring Trump's first major speech in Washington since 2021.
We're going to stop the invasion of our borders. We're going to reclaim our wealth. We're going to unlock the liquid gold that's right under our feet.
Though frigid weather pushed Monday's inauguration indoors with room for VIPs only, it hasn't dampened excitement.
My wife and I were a little disappointed, but we're here. The joy is in the journey. Trump is back!
When it comes to what supporters are most looking forward to over the next 4 years, one common thread is immigration reform.
Safer America, that's the number one right there. Immigration, we got to get these people out of our country.
One supporter, who recently became a U.S. citizen, says this was the first election she ever cast a vote in.
I think the history books will write as the best president that ever was, and a strong leader for the world, because we need it.
Now, there's already a very heavy security presence here in Washington, and tomorrow there's expected to be at least 25,000 law enforcement officers on hand. Bianca Fascini, Global News, Washington.
Taking on Trump next. The Canadian politicians making their case in Washington. Can they turf the tariffs? Well, this is the error message millions of Americans woke up to this morning after social media app TikTok was shut down. But today, the Chinese-owned parent company says it's restoring service following word from President-elect Donald Trump that he will issue an executive order tomorrow, delaying a federal ban. Trump says he wants to make a deal to protect national security and wants the U.S. to have a 50% ownership position in a joint venture. Another executive order that Trump could sign tomorrow, tariffs, which is partly why a number of high-profile Canadians are now in Washington, including Alberta Premier Daniel Smith, who recently met with the president-elect. Our David Akin is also in Washington and joins us now. David.
Well, Carolyn, Premier Daniel Smith is the most senior political leader that has made the trip here to Washington, but there are plenty of others.
From Ottawa, 2 ministers of the Trudeau government are en route here. Industry Minister François-Philippe Champagne and Trade Minister Mary Ng, and 2 ministers from the Ford government in Ontario, including the Energy Minister Stephen Lecce.
We're going to take that message constructively and positively to particularly Republican leaders in the Congress to make clear that we are stronger together.
Canadians in D.C. will also be telling Americans that Trump's tariffs will harm the American economy.
These are jobs at stake. I mean, it's not just Canadian jobs. There's 1.3 million American jobs directly tied to this trade relationship.
Cattle rancher Jeff Yorba spent the last 2 weeks in Denver at the biggest trade show for livestock in the U.S.
The American industry knows that the price of these tariffs, or the cost of the tariffs, is not going to be good for them. They've been in Washington for months, working to make sure that the beef industry is exempt from this because of the reciprocal nature of our trade.
Canadian political leaders would rather push the positive message of boosting trade in a tariff-free Canadian-American relationship. But they're also reminding Americans that Canada will retaliate if those tariffs take effect. Ontario, for example, is ready to hit the off switch for 1.5 million Americans that use Ontario electricity to light their homes.
While we prefer to send more energy and work closer with the U.S., we do have options to respond and retaliate in defense of the broader national interest.
Now, this full court press by Canadian business and political leaders is a function, some of them tell me, by a perceived lack of leadership from the federal government. With the Prime Minister on the way out, some believe there's a vacuum there, and they are stepping up to fill it. Carolyn.
David Aiken in Washington, thank you. Ahead, the extreme cold weather warnings in place for much of central and eastern Canada. Icy conditions gripped Saskatoon today, where temperatures hovered near -30. With a wind chill, it felt more like -40. And that isn't even the coldest place in the country. An extreme cold snap fueled by a blast of Arctic air has triggered weather warnings from the prairies to Quebec this weekend and into tomorrow. Wind chill values may drop into the -40s for many regions and even -55 in Nunavut. There are 2 food recalls to tell you about tonight. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency is warning people not to consume Sweet Cream brand mini pastries because of salmonella concerns. So far, 61 people have become sick in BC, Alberta, Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick, 17 of them requiring hospitalization. The products were distributed at various places, including bakeries, hotels, and restaurants. The CFIA is also warning people in BC, Manitoba, and Ontario not to consume 6 brands of eggs over possible salmonella contamination. The recall includes Compliments, Foremost, Golden Valley, IGA, No Name, and Western Family eggs. So far, there are no confirmed illnesses. Next, the rubble and ruins of a place called home, what Gazans are returning to. With the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas now in effect, Gazans are finally able to return to what's left of their homes. Journalists are now also able to access the area and share images of places that were until today mostly cut off. As Mike Armstrong reports, what they're finding are stories of people relieved at the potential end of this conflict, but also devastated by the destruction.
It is a strange place to see smiles, but they're there. They are still painful times, but there is a feeling for many displaced Gazans that on this day they are at least walking in the right direction, towards home. This man says he is joyful, as if it were a holiday, even though he lost many loved ones. After months away from home, thousands of displaced Gazans jumped at the chance to go back, even before it was safe. This family of 10 didn't wait for the ceasefire to go into effect and headed back to their home in Jabalia in northern Gaza early Sunday morning. What they found, they say, was heartbreak and tears. We came with hope, the mother says, thinking we might find just a single room, just a small shelter to protect us. But when we arrived, we found the situation as you see it, tragic. The family spent part of the day salvaging what they could and then turned to shelter, trying to build something. Even with the structure barely standing, they will stay. At the other end of Gaza, in Rafah, another family returned home Sunday. The 9 members of the Abu Mohsen family were forced to move over and over during the last 7 months. They hadn't been home since and didn't know if there'd be anything left. There was. This man says it's an indescribable feeling, a complete joy, but that there are others who will find their homes and neighborhoods wiped out. They won't feel our feelings, he says. An American study this month found about 60% of buildings in the Gaza Strip have been damaged or destroyed. A UN study puts it at 70%. Both are high numbers that on this day seem easier to believe. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Montreal.
And that is Global National for this Sunday night. I'm Carolyn Jarvis. We leave you tonight with more emotional scenes from Israel and Gaza as a long-awaited ceasefire and hostage exchange begins. Thanks for watching. Donna will be back with you tomorrow. Have a great night.